Welcome to our new video series, Speed Data, quick conversations with cybersecurity leaders. I'm your host, Megan Garza, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with Patrick Benoit, Global Chief Information Security Officer for Brinks. For our audience, Pat has an impressive background as a security leader for companies like CBRE Real Estate, Experian, and Dell, and is an active board member for NCS Madison Corps and the North Texas chapter of InfraGard. Not only is Pat certified as a CISO, CISM, CISSP, PMP, and Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, but he's also a commercial pilot and flight instructor.
Yeah.
What a resume, Pat.
You just got to fill your time with something.
It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So you have an impressive and extensive background, and you recently joined the Brinks team. You're 4 months in?
That's correct. November 1st. So 4 months. I changed my password about a month ago for the first time. So that was the indication.
That's your indicator. That's the trigger. How's that going for you?
It's going great. It's a wonderful company and I've got an incredible team. We have plenty of opportunities to do great things going forward, but it's been fast and furious. But that's what I would expect, and so we have a plan. We're going to execute on it and we're having a good time.
That's fantastic. And not only do you work in cybersecurity, but you work in an industry in which security might be the most important thing to uphold, protecting financial assets and minimizing liability for your customers. How's that different from your previous roles in security?
Well, so I'd say, yes, there may be some physical assets that are different. When you start talking about our services that move cash and move valuables and such like that. So there is a different aspect there. But when you talk purely about information security, I don't think it's that much different. Data is data, sensitive data is sensitive data. We have customers that are businesses that we have to protect their data. We have to protect our own data. And then ultimately those customers have their customers or their clients, however they view them, that their data has to be protected. We have to follow same regulations and we have to raise our game, even if our data is not considered regulated or what we do consider regulated, what our customers do maybe. And so that's the same in every other company I've been at. We raise our standards to the level to support the customer at their level. So that's the same.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You recently shared on the CISO Talk podcast your 4 rules for leadership, and I'm going to read them here. Integrity, that nothing is personal, and you went on to clarify that when someone mistreats you, for example, it's more of a reflection on them than it is you.
Correct.
Number 3, never make assumptions. And lastly, always do your best. How did you come up with these rules? Was it past experience that influenced you to kind of follow these guidelines, or how did you come up with them?
Well, I can't take credit for coming up with them. They came from a book called The 4 Agreements, which was written by a gentleman named Don Miguel Ruiz.
Okay.
And it's been around for quite a while. It really is more focused on the personal aspects of things, emotional IQ and dealing with people in general. But I think it's fairly universal. And because it made such good sense to me about just how to live your life in general, it became something that I started introducing to my teams and saying, these are the rules that I'm going to try and live by. These are the rules that I would hope that you will try to live by. And I'm going to set some expectations around those. I think in many ways, they help to mitigate some of the confrontation that may go on, especially that don't take it personally.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want anybody to misunderstand and think that means that you have to roll over and be a doormat. That's not the case. But it does mean that when somebody's having a difficult time communicating properly, that it's okay to say, look, I think we need to step back and wait until we're both in proper frame of mind. It's always good to put yourself in the same boat as them too. So I would never call somebody out and say, look, you're being a jerk. Let's talk later. But instead just say, look, we're obviously not at the right place right now to have this conversation. So let's step back and we'll re-engage this conversation when we have time. And that's how you keep it from being personal.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a great lesson in life, not just work.
And it's a hard lesson too, because, the last residual or remnants of any kind of not giving grace and not taking that stuff personally for me was in driving. You still feel so protected in that little shell that you
Yeah.
still want to rant and rave. And my fiance said at one point when I was ranting about something, not road raging, just ranting internally, she said, "You realize they can't hear you, right?"
Yeah.
And I went, "Oh, wow. Yeah, I
That's
guess
great.
that's true." So we always have to continue to work on those things. There's always room for self improvement.
Yeah. That's funny. What I always tell myself is I don't know if the car in front of me that's driving like a maniac. What I always say is, well, what if their wife is in labor and they're like on the way to the hospital and that's what's going on? Like that's my go-to.
That's the don't make assumptions that they're
Yes.
just being jerks. Yeah.
And what was the name of that book again? Because I want to look it up.
Called The Four Agreements.
Okay.
And they actually have one now called The Five Agreements. They've added an agreement, but you get too many and it gets a little confusing.
And it's the same author, same premise and everything.
Yes, it's Don Miguel Ruiz.
Perfect. How would you say the threat landscape has changed since you began your career?
What has changed is the speed at which they can execute threats. Threats can be executed, exploits can be executed. Early on, it took some time for people to maybe research, gather enough information and do reconnaissance to figure out how they were going to attack. Early on, most of the attacks had to do with folks just being able to brag that they were able to do it, or they had some kind of activists or cause that they were fighting for. And it has now become a money industry. It has become organized crime in many cases. And the tools that are out there to execute these threats, these exploits are automated. And so it's so much faster, so much easier for anybody to get involved. It's actually now become a commodity market where some of these organized crime groups are selling as a service the exploits. And so anybody can go on the dark web and buy what they need to do. So that's the big change. And then that also carries over into the social engineering aspect, which is the biggest challenge that we have, because you can't always automate away social engineering. You can't always put in tools that protect you against social engineering. We talk about AI being the next, the big thing that's going to make the attackers much more effective. Well, it will, but it's not that it'll make them more effective at attacking devices. I think it's going to first make them much more effective at attacking people, because it's going to give them the ability at speed of light to create social engineering attacks, to gather research about people. With all of us doing social media and stuff now, so much of who we are is an open book. And so it makes it very easy for the attacker. Those are the things that I think have changed over time.
Yeah. And do you think ransomware as a service and social engineering attacks are the biggest threat or risk to cybersecurity? Or what would you say the biggest threat is to cybersecurity on the horizon?
I think I'm fairly well supported in statistics in saying that the easiest vector and the number one vector is social engineering. I mean, is the people. If you think about ransomware, the vast majority, if not all the time, that ransomware isn't planted until they somehow exploit a person to get there. They got to get credentials somewhere. That's the basis. And so usually that comes from social engineering. So I don't view ransomware on the attack side as that much different. Very, very different on the recovery side, the respond and recover side. But on the attack side, if you are able to identify, detect, and protect up front, kind of doesn't matter what the exploit intention was.
Yeah.
You've had the ability to stop it. But ransomware clearly is, in my opinion, the greatest threat on a response and recovery side of the house, because very difficult to recover from sometimes, depending on if you've planned for it well. Very difficult to respond to because you have this immediacy to make sure, and you do with all exploits, but in this case, you have an immediacy to make sure you contain it, an urgency that is much greater than if you don't contain maybe some other malware attack. You may end up with a bunch of relay servers or something like that, but your devices aren't going to get locked out and encrypted and you lose everything. So
Yeah.
I think there's a much greater risk that response recovery side than with other types of exploits.
Yeah, I agree. Something your audience may not know is that you're basically the spokesperson, the most interesting man in the world.
Oh,
In addition to being an aviator extraordinaire, you teach Aikido, ride motorcycles, scuba dive. So I wonder, if you were in cybersecurity, what would you be doing?
I actually considered flying after I sold my company years ago. But frankly, the problem isn't the way aviation is set up to get started. Much like many industries, you have to start the first level and kind of work your way up to be able to get the position and make the money. So there's at least a handful of years or more of rising through the ranks. And I was already at a point in my career where I wasn't willing to take that step back to
Yeah.
make that happen. So, yeah, it might have been aviation. Now that I've gotten older, I've passed 21, really want to do some things now that are people oriented and being a more holistic person, learning to flourish. My fiance works in that wellness, well-being industry, and that's a concept that we're working. Again, came from another book. It's not something that we created, but this idea of flourishing instead of just being happy or
Yeah.
being well. Instead, looking at all the aspects and how do you bring those together so that you're truly growing, flourishing, happy, content, well-rounded individual. So, we're looking at ways that we can bring that into our life and teach and share with other people downstream.
I like that. The idea of flourishing, not just simply existing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, lastly, before we go, could you share with me one thing that you wish future cybersecurity professionals knew?
Probably the greatest thing is, and I had this similar thought when I used to be a software developer too. And one of the things was people were always very focused on knowing this particular language or that particular language. And we have the same thing now with security is knowing this particular product or this particular application or this specific field. And we oftentimes get so specialized that we forget that the opportunity is really going to be in the generalist that can know all of those things and put them all together to create a more holistic, more global plan for how do you protect everything, not just, how do I make sure this authentication is working only. So it's okay to start out specializing, but I think if you overlook the opportunity to generalize some and generalize outside of security, I was telling potential CISOs and CISOs at a conference recently in an interview discussion that if you're not studying sales technique and storytelling techniques and, just business in general, you're shortchanging yourself because that's where the opportunity lies to really grow and really have impact is by getting to that business side where you can truly understand and help the business succeed.
I mean, being a CISO is more than just knowing about technology, knowing about cybersecurity, but like you said, kind of being more well-rounded about all facets of the business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Pat, it was such a treat to have you on today. Thank you for your time and your insight. As always, if our audience has any questions they'd like to see asked on our next Speed Data episode, please email me at mgarza@varonis.com. Thanks again for your time, Pat. Talk soon.
Thank you. It was an honor.